how to make better bass for indie pop music. Let's take the number one most important thing when writing bass, which is the chords themselves don't really matter that much. This is actually the bass that I've built for it, but let's take this bass and let's make it a little more simple so we can go through the steps to making better bass lines. So I simplified the bass line to just following the root notes of the chords. So let's see how it sounds. Let's spice it up a bit. I've switched the D sharp for an A sharp, which is the fifth of the chord that's playing, to give it some nice tension when the track just starts. And also here, I'm not giving it the root notes of the chords, so that when the actual verse drops, it gives a sense of release to it. Let's hear it with the changed notes. Now another very important thing when it comes to writing bass lines is using different octaves. For example, here you can see that I've moved some notes in an octave higher than the original. Playing higher octave bass notes gives it some more tension, and the lower notes kind of give it like a sense of release. So I'm playing around with the tension a lot more here by actually switching them from the lower octave to the higher octave. And it also gives a nice movement, especially when it's paired to something like this. A great thing about bass, and I see this often being misused, is it has its own rhythm and harmony to it. My whole thing with bass is to actually make it so it bridges the gap between the drums, the percussion, and the other like harmonic instruments. As you can see, the bass hits don't always hit whenever a drum plays or whenever a piano plays a chord, for that matter. It has its own rhythm and it bridges the gap between those two. So let's give it a listen. Instead of following the rhythm of either the piano or the drums, it has its own little rhythm. It gives the whole track a lot more movement. For the next thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to bass is humanizing stuff. And in particular, there are some very specific things when it comes to humanizing bass that kind of takes it to the next level. So let's go over it. The basic humanization process involves just alternating the velocities. So for example, for this higher notes, right, it plays on a higher strings. The string doesn't vibrate as loud as these lower strings. So I have to lower the velocity on these ones, right? Because you're also not going to hit the higher strings too hard. Kind of like fucks up the sound. It makes them sound kind of ugly and it's not fitting us, especially to this track. Be very careful with humanizing velocities because you can go overboard with it and make some mistakes. But as a general rule of thumb, I would usually stick with having like a few accents here and there, especially on the downbeats. And for the other notes, just lowering the velocities. And that's pretty much all. Now for the timing, humanizing also means timing adjustments. So let's go over this ones also. You can see here that these hits are perfectly on grid, and it means moving the note tighter before or after the hit. Kind of secret thing that people don't usually talk about when humanizing bass is adding this little like sneaky pauses here and there. These sneaky little pauses give it a lot more like groove and rhythm and bounce to it. For example, these two, right? These have this little like pause in between here, which if this wouldn't be here, it would sound a lot more like robotic and slightly less groovy. So for example, also here, because it's also like if you're physically going to play a bass or an instrument, you can't just have like perfect legato between the notes, right? It's gonna have like a little imperfection or like a little pause to it. And this is emulating that. And also here, so for example, at the end of each bar, you can have your note cut short by a 16th note to give it the downbeat a lot more impact. Also, another thing that happens with like real life instruments is spillovers. What I mean by that is, for example, here you can see that the C note spills over this D sharp note, right? You can see here. Another very interesting thing to use in your bass lines, especially when it comes to indie pop music, is having these little bass runs. What that means is that usually at the end of your bar or maybe like in the middle of it, you would have a quick run of notes, meaning you would play them a bit faster and usually a bit higher. So for example, this one. Right, instead of having just one single sustained note, you have this little play here that just gives it a bit more movement. And you can use this especially when the other instruments are not playing, but don't overdo them. Another very crucial thing when it comes to writing bass for indie pop music is choosing the right bass for your song. So what I'm using here is a double bass, like an actual acoustic bass, and I've chosen that because it sounds soft, it sounds shiny, it has a soft attack, it's not very present in the mix, right? It's everything that I need for this type of song, but you have to be very intentional about the bass sound that you want to use in your song. So you can use a picked electric bass, you can use a fingered electric bass, because all of these have certain like specific tones and they fit each different song in their own particular way. You can use a synth bass, you can sometimes, I've heard indie pop music with 808s in it, but you have to be very specific about the tone of the bass that you're gonna use, right? So yeah, that's it. Bye.